are a go. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are watching this, and welcome to episode 6 of season 3 of the Historians Lounge. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining us today is a returning guest making their second appearance here on the show. Now, this guest specializes in military history and teaches military history at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, focusing in on medieval warfare in Western Europe and the Middle East. And he has authored numerous books on the medieval period and consulted on multiple projects. And in today's episode, we'll be talking about his upcoming book, which is The History of the True Cross. And I'm very excited to delve into this topic. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to a returning guest, Professor John D. Hosler. Professor Hosler, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Great to be back.
Awesome. So before we dive into today's topic, Professor Hosler, would you like to tell our viewers and listeners what you have been up to since the last time you were on the show?
Things have been a little busy, I guess you could say. We have around 1,000 students here at the Command and General Staff College. And so we've been working through this academic year and getting them through their courses, helping them out. And they've all graduated last week.
Nice.
So that's all. It's always fantastic to see the majors go off to their respective units and do good work for our country and as well as other countries. We have 121 international officers this year from 90 some different countries. So they're all off to their home units as well. And so it's great to see that happen. And then on the research front, I've been busy with working on 3 books, actually.
Wow.
One of them, 2 are edited volumes and another is a monograph. The edited volume had one come out last year. It's called the Rutledge Handbook for Medieval Military Strategy, which I co-edited with Daniel Frank. And that's, I forget now, 31 essays on military strategy in the Middle Ages around the world on 6 different continents. And that was a big long-term project, and that came out last year. And then the other one hopefully will be coming out this year, a book on the Third Crusade that I'm editing with Stephen Bennett, The Third Crusade, New Interpretations. And we're in the process right now of writing up marketing blurbs for that and choosing the cover image and those sorts of things. And so that's projected for later in the year. So between that means I've been editing, let's see, over 40 colleagues' essays on different topics, which is a different task than writing your own book, editing other people's work, which is challenging and on a number of different levels, and humbling at the same time. You get to read, the genius of these other people. Mm-hmm. So those things have been keeping me busy. And then the book you mentioned on the True Cross, I've just started writing that in April. That is a project. The manuscript is due next April, and so I gave myself 1 year to write it. And so this spring I started, and I'm about finished with the first chapter and ready to move on to the next one.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to hear about all that. And you have been very, very busy, Professor Hosler. And I'm very curious to learn more about this new book that you're working on, which is The History of the True Cross. So let's actually do a little overview for our viewers and listeners. So when you began researching this topic, the history of the True Cross, what sort of came to this, discussion? Like, what drew you to learning about this history and wanting to write about it and share it with people?
Well, I've always had a bit of an interest in religious relics. They are, you don't have to do history to run into them. Of course, you can see them in churches, you can see them in museums, and so it's something I've always kind of noticed throughout my adult life. But I think the cross itself, I came to it like a lot of historians do, through studying the Crusades. Because it really is, the Crusades are where it's most prominent in its entire history. principally because of the role of the relic at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 against Saladin, where he defeats the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and captures that piece of the true cross, and then they try to get it back. The Crusaders try to get it back over the course of subsequent campaigns and never do. And I think that's really where my strong interest peaked. And like I said, I'm not alone, because this is something that most historians notice as they go through the records of those wars, and they see it, and they see its prominence, they see its importance, and end up talking about it in certain ways and fashions. But what I started thinking about is, okay, the cross is important in these different ways during the Crusades, but this isn't, obviously these things weren't discovered in the 12th century. They were discovered, the fragments of the cross, and I should say purported cross, and I make that very clear in my book, the cross that is alleged by people to have been the cross that Jesus Christ died on, knowing that there's no way to absolutely prove that, unless you had a camera in the 1st century AD and you track the wood forever, but the cross that was discovered by the Empress Helenea in the 4th century and was held up to be, that relic. I started thinking about, well, what about the relic before the Crusades? And that's been explored to some degree by scholars, the relic in Byzantium and in Western Europe and in local shrines and in churches in the West. And as I started conceptualizing, I'm like, well, it seems to have a history before the Crusades that's pretty lengthy. And I read some of the primary sources for it. And so, okay, so there's some documentation. And then what more striking to me is how it retained its importance after the Crusades. That even when those wars were done, that it's still around, and for my interest as a military historian, was still being used on military campaigns. And so that I followed that a little bit, and I realized that that the cross was actually in use all the way up until the present day, and in war. And what really clarified that for me was something that happened in the year 2022, in the Russian-Ukraine war that we're still dealing with today. A piece of the True Cross was involved in a Black Sea fleet action, where the Ukrainians sunk a Russian ship that actually had a piece of the True Cross on board. And that was in 2022. And so that sort of was another clarifying moment for me, because I could sort of see the ends of this, right? The Empress Helenea discovers the artifact in the 4th century, and then here we are in the 21st century, and it's still making appearances. And so I decided, hey, why not think about closing the distance on those and doing a history of the cross over time. And so that's how I arrived at the book, which is going to be, I guess, 16 centuries or so of the cross on military campaigns.
Fascinating. And this actually almost kind of reminds me of another discussion I had with another historian, Dr. Faith Tibble, who wrote a book on, the crown of thorns and the depiction of Jesus Christ's crown of thorns and where it appears in history that we most know it to be, and then like the history before it and after. So I'm kind of getting that same kind of reaction from, your book, and something that's very similar, which also has to deal with religious iconography, religious symbolism. And I've always been fascinated about that particular piece in history, because it's been depicted numerous times in media. Sometimes it's depicted as literally a giant golden crucifix that is deemed as the true cross. In some cases, it's either a splinter of the purported or theorized cross. But it's just so fascinating how just one piece of this thing has existed in human history, and yet has played a significant role in the development and expansion of human consciousness and human history. So I'm very curious. So as you said before, Dr. Hosler, that it sort of makes its appearance from the layperson standpoint in the Crusades, because that's when it's most remembered. But in your research, it's actually been reported earlier, with Empress Helena. So how did that sort of come about? What's the story of how Empress Helena finds what she believes to be a piece of the true cross, and what is the significance of her having it at that time?
Yeah, great question, and I appreciate the reference to Dr. Tibble's work. I met her several years ago, and I'm using her work on the Crown of Thorns, because what typically happens is you don't just see the true cross by itself. It's usually, well, not usually, but very often spotted alongside the other, what we call the passion relics, the thorn, the sponge, the reed, the nails, those sorts of things from the crucifixion scene. So yeah, and I've been spotting, and I need to send her a note about this. I've been spotting thorns from the crown all over the place, where people will just have one thorn, and they are all around. Yeah, it's interesting that, as you say, that the Helena story, as I think about it, I think for medieval historians, we probably encounter the true cross most prominently on the Crusades, but the Helena story is probably more famous now that you mention it, than the story about Saladin, because when you go to Rome, and you can see the great artworks that have been created in dedication to the event. We're talking about frescoes and statues and whatnot of Helena and the story, and so that's probably the most famous story about the cross, I suppose. But there hasn't been a movie like Kingdom of Heaven that showcased it the way that the Crusades, sort of has their benefactor. The story about Helena is interesting, and there's all kinds of controversy about it. Of course, there's a new book out claiming that Helena could not have been in Jerusalem at the time of its discovery.
Okay.
Which throws some serious heat at the whole proposition, and it's going to be interesting to see where that discussion goes. But aside from that piece, which is very new, and as I said, we're still kind of waiting for responses, right? The traditional story is that Helena went to Jerusalem in the 320s, and had an interest and a passion for antiquities, I suppose, and started digging up Christian sites, places where these relics, these artifacts were supposedly buried, where buildings had been located, and that sort of thing. Because the Jerusalem of the early 3rd century looks very different than the Jerusalem before the Romans had turned the Temple Mount into a kind of a colony, and put a temple to Jupiter on top. And so she starts digging around and locates the spot where this cross is buried. There's differing stories about how she located it, because in the early going, the idea is that, well, some locals, they helped inform her, but later on, in a story which becomes known as the legend of the true cross, you have a Jewish figure who kind of spills the beans against his father's wishes. He lets people know that actually the story is he converted to Christianity, and so he wanted to let people know where the site was. And so it's with the assistance of a Jew whose name is Judas, interestingly enough, who helps her out. So, and that's a later tradition. So kind of an add-on that people came about later. But in any case, she gets this information. They dig on what is now presently the hill of Golgotha, inside today's Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and they discover inside, depending on the story, either 1 or 3 crosses. And here we're talking about, like you mentioned earlier, the full big cross, the whole enchilada, and then they take, depending on the story, either that cross or the 3 crosses around town and test it. So they find someone who is very ill, and they bring the cross up to that person. And in the solo cross story, the person is healed, right? The miraculous properties of the cross are manifest. In the other version, they try the first cross, doesn't work. They try the second cross, doesn't work. They try the third, and it finally works. And it's almost like I don't want to be irreverent, but it's almost like the story of the 3 pigs, right? The house of straw doesn't work. The house of wood doesn't work, and of course it's in 3, which is symbolically very important. But that's the story. And then the other crosses, of course, belong to, by tradition, the two thieves who were hanged with Jesus, right? And one of them being Saint Dismas, the thief on the cross who repents, and who Jesus says, today you'll be, with me in paradise, right? So at that point you have, so you've got the cross, and now you have to decide what to do with it, because it's a giant cross. It's not exactly something you can, put across your back and carry all the way back to Rome. So immediately after its discovery, almost immediately, it's broken up into 4 major pieces. And those are distributed to 4 spots in the Roman Empire. One of them going back to Rome, of course, right? And one of them staying in Jerusalem, another one to Syria. And then, as you can see, you'd kind of take it and disperse it. And that begins the tradition of the dispersal of the cross, in which it is over time cut up and further cut up and further cut up into lots of different pieces. Some of them being large, what I would refer to as sort of chunks, big pieces of wood. I mean, reputedly, the one at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris in the 18th century was still 2 feet long. Right. So large ones, or the ones that most people think of, the splinters, right? Where it's no bigger than the width of a hair. And these are the ones you'll see most often today, because there are so many of these little splinters. Because if you imagine, you take a tree and you divide it into splinters, that's a lot of splinters, right?
Right.
So the division of it begins almost immediately, and we can track those major pieces. I think, at least I'm going to argue, we can reasonably track them for about 150 years, where those major pieces go. And then after that, too many divisions, too many splinters, it starts going up everywhere, and you can no longer trace all of them back to Helena. So instead of playing the game of, can I trace it back to Helena and her discovery, you play a different kind of game, which is, well, can I trace it back to one of those 4 major divisions, or can I trace it back to one of the next 8 divisions? That sort of thing.
Right.
And that's what you have to do if you want to demonstrate the provenance of any piece, you have to try to be able to kind of bring it back in history. And as I said in the opener, the best you can do really is to bring it back to Helena. You may be able to do that with some pieces. In fact, with some of them, you can. But that does not demonstrate that you can then go back 3 more centuries to the actual crucifixion. And that's where it becomes the leap of faith for believers, right? You have to take the leap, because there's no way to really cross that 3-century distance, because they were either, if they were in the hole in the ground, they were either the crosses that he died on or not.
That is very true. That is very true. And this kind of leads into a discussion I had with another guest on this show, when it talks about, religious artifacts and iconography and overall their symbolism and their place. And of course, you're talking about religious artifacts in Anglo-Saxon England, early medieval period, before the Vikings invaded, and like the cult of saints that popped up around Europe, whether it's like, a piece of bone of a saint or a religious figure, and just the power that these artifacts had. And I'm very curious, John, if that's kind of what we're almost seeing, at least in your research that you've uncovered, that the shards of the true cross that appear in history are taking on this kind of religious fever for those who find it and place it in a temple of worship, or even use it as some political motivation or gambit for something.
Well, it has a lot of uses. That any religious artifact can be employed in different ways, right? So you can use it for it's simply a devotional purpose, right? You have it in your church. You have it in your church. You usually there's a reason you want it in your church. For it could be for your own devotion, your own commitment to one of the saints, a local commitment to one of those saints, or a means of drawing people to to visit your locale. So here we're talking about pilgrimages to go and visit these objects, right? So there's enormous number of uses, and then they build into liturgical practices as well, because you can have church ceremonies and church liturgies that feature the relic if it's on a certain feast day, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
If you kind of push it outside of the ecclesiastical building, they can have, for lack of a better term, I don't want to call it secular because that's not the right word, really sort of governmental official purposes. In the Byzantine Empire, for example, they would on military expeditions carry relics with them when carrying out the duties of their office in terms of receiving visitors. You might have relics present. We know that in Russia, from the 10th century forward, relics were used to seal alliances and to swear oaths on. So kind of a way of demonstrating, as you might with the Book of the Gospels, you could also do it with a relic.
Right.
So lots and lots of purposes that you can bend these things towards. And the pilgrimage aspect is one that gets talked about an awful lot, because it's you don't have to think about it too much to kind of see the if this then what scenarios, right? So if I can acquire relics which will drive pilgrims to my church and town, then obviously the better, more prominent relics will draw more people. If I have a relic of, say, John the Baptist, that's much better than that of a local saint like Saint Martial or someone who regionally might be well known, but outside of southern France, not so many people know about, right? So prominent objects, and then the multiplication of them, the more of them I can get, then it gets better and better and better, right? That leads, of course, to the practice of forgeries and fakes, because now you've got a market. You have people who, and of course, what I'm describing here slowly develops over the course of several hundred years, right?
Right.
But yeah, it becomes a market. Oh, well, you want a relic, I can get you a relic. And that sort of thing just starts getting skewered in literature because everybody knows it's going on. Fakes appear in the Canterbury Tales, for example, and are ridiculed. So you've got now there's a business aspect to them that goes along with everything else. And then once you get into the later period, particularly when you get to early modern Europe, the personal comes into it, where it's not just that I want relics for my chapel, for my cathedral, for my town, to draw pilgrims, to draw interest. You have rulers who actually have personal collections of relics that are really for themselves.
Right.
So people like Philip II of Spain, who has a collection, it's 7,000 personal relics. He's got, I think, I can look up the number here because the number is absolutely fascinating. It is in a personal building in the Escorial in France. Yeah, here it is. Let's see. 7,422 relics.
Whoa.
The body parts of no fewer than 3,500 martyrs, 12 whole bodies of saints, 144 heads of saints, as well as relics like the True Cross and pieces of the Crown of Thorns and that sort of thing, right? So at that point, now you're onto something. Now this is a little different than what's come before, right? Because now you have very wealthy individuals who have a lot of territory, and they are gathering unto themselves all of these things. For what reason? Surely devotional reasons. Philip had a window built into his bedroom so he could look at these relics anytime he wanted. Philip II did. Devotional reasons, sure, but also what museum historians have been studying a lot lately in terms of just collections, of just the idea of having a collection and they used to be called these cabinets of curiosity, kind of the first displays where people can come in and see these things, and you can actually bring in tourists and important visitors and whatnot, come see my relic collection. They may not be interested in the devotional aspects at all. They may be looking at it from more of an antiquarian perspective. We go to museums because we just love to see old things. And here's 12 bodies of departed saints. So it really does it becomes very multifaceted, very diverse over time. But the common denominator, of course, is sort of just a fascination with them. They are objects of fascination. They all carry stories. They all have narratives, and anything that has a story, it's very easy to get people to want to know more about it.
Absolutely. And that almost kind of reminds me of another story of another famous passion relic is, of course, the spear of Longinus, the spear that stabbed Jesus in the side, and how that has taken on a new form, and how scholars and historians have been trying to figure out and determine whether or not the spear that is in possession of the church is indeed the spear during the 1st century AD. And it takes on, again, this life of its own, that there are stories written about, that it has these properties of healing, and that it's almost like you don't want to touch because you believe that the power that resides in it is going to be too overwhelming. And it's a very fascinating how these objects can hold so much sway over people. So now let's jump ahead in time to your research. So after Helena's discovery of the true cross and the divisions into numerous pieces, what is the next appearance of either a shard or a section of the true cross that appears in human history? And what is its overall role and purpose at that time?
Well, I would say, I mean, it starts showing up immediately after.
Okay.
Yeah, as soon as you're into the 400s, it's showing up, and into the 500s. They're being distributed. They're going around, right? You start to get in that sort of early medieval period. We hear the requests for relics, and we hear the sending out of relics around. So if you read, for example, and this is not the true cross, but this is a reference to the chains of St. Peter, which held him when he was imprisoned in Rome. The letters of Pope Gregory the Great, who dies in 604. Lots of references that he'll write to friends and associates, and he'll send them kind of shavings from the chain of St. Peter, right? As sort of a gift. As thank you, here's a letter for you. Thank you for your earlier correspondence. And now I'm sending you these things so that you can have them. So you start to see relics of all kinds being distributed like that. And it's no less true with the true cross. You start to see big fragments going around. The trouble is that very often some of the early literature will not specify what relics are traveling. And so it becomes a little tricky. So if you go to West Francia, for example, during, say, Merovingian and then early Carolingian years, right?
Right.
You'll see that, Charlemagne and his predecessors are in a sense, I don't know if ordering is the right word, but sort of obtaining relics through the process known as translation, in which a saint's body might be dug up and moved to a new place, right? It's the cynic would call it grave robbing. The devout would call it the translation of saintly relics, right? And so you see these requests, and you see these, I'm bringing to you these relics, I'm bringing these to you, and very often the narrative sources we have don't actually say what the relics are.
Okay.
That's kind of at the vaguest notion. I'm bringing you these relics. Okay, that's great. A step up from that would be, I'm bringing you the relics of Saint so-and-so, but not specifying, what does that mean? Is it the thigh bone? Is it the head? Is it the pinky finger? Is it his cloak? Is it his backpack? Is it a vial of his blood? So the relics of Saint so-and-so, but without description. And then eventually you get into accounts that start describing the exact relics. And so it can be a little tricky to say what's being moved where, but we do know that that the true cross specifically is being moved around in the 5th and 6th centuries through some contemporary documents, and then some later documents that tell stories that you don't necessarily know whether to believe them or not, but kind of looking back saying, well, I've accessed some records and here's what I saw. So we know they're on the move, and we know they're being used in war at the latest in 717. which is the first. And I say that the first, that may be wrong because I haven't written this chapter yet. I've just been gathering information on it.
Right.
But I could say the first prominent allegation of it being used is at the siege of Constantinople in 717. Now that's from a much later source. Who knows? It could have made the whole thing up. But at least the story of its use in war is at that siege when supposedly the Emperor Leo of Byzantium takes it down to the water and strikes the sea with the piece of the true cross, which has the effect of sinking the Arab attack ships that had come to besiege the city. And so the kind of the power of that cross on display. That's the other one. If you want to call it a reference, there are stories about Constantine. And I still don't know exactly what to make of these because there's so many variations that his mother gave him a piece that he inserted either into his helmet or the bridle of his horse and then rode off to war. So I suppose that would be the earliest military application, like in the immediacy of discovering it.
Right.
I don't know that we really have great proof for that. But that certainly becomes the legend that he did this. And then you see different strands of stories will pick it up. Well, he either put it in his helmet or in his bridle. But the one I see that in the medieval sense is that siege of Constantinople in 717. And then after that, it's off to the races. You start seeing pieces involved in wars all over the place, and being used in a lot of different ways. And I think that's one thing that really captured my attention. And I gave a talk on this last year here in Kansas City, the different applications of the True Cross relic in war. As you would think, most relics, if they're used in war, they're kind of carried into war and they're present and they provide sort of inspiration. Right. So it's sort of a morale booster. Right. It's something that will get the soldiers get their confidence back, help them stand firm in the line, and be ready to fight. Right. What I found is that at least with the True Cross, and this may be true with other relics, I'm sure it probably is. I found 6 other applications of being used in war. So, for example, command and control. Right, like enabling a commander to better move his men around. That the cross enables him to do that. The changing the weather, like atmospheric aspects. Ivan the Terrible, who you may have heard of before, at the siege of Kazan in 1552, supposedly uses the True Cross to dispel a storm. There's a storm at the siege, and it's messing with his artillery. Because he wants to use his cannon against the walls of Kazan. But imagine these early cannons, right? You know, you're lighting the wick, it's going out. I mean, the rain is bad, the wind is bad. And so they pull out the True Cross and it dispels the bad weather, right? I've seen accounts of it shifting wind. There's a fight against Nur al-Din at one point where this grass fire pops up. And William of Tyre says they pull out the True Cross and the wind changes direction and blows the fire back on the Muslims. Right.
Wow.
So things like that, or amplifying the effectiveness of your weapons. On the 7th Crusade, supposedly a piece of the True Cross helps the French crossbowmen shoot faster and more accurately. So these are really kind of, once you start breaking it down and saying, okay, so I'm spotting the True Cross here, 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 and here, and then you start thinking about, well, how is it actually being used?
Right.
It becomes so much more interesting and complex. The trouble, of course, is like all miracles, right? Because these would all be miraculous occurrences that a fragment of wood can make your crossbowmen shoot faster, right? It's all how they were perceived and written about by the authors.
Right.
It could be it never happened. Or it could be that those crossbowmen were indeed shooting faster, but they were doing it because they were doing it for their king. They were doing it for their comrades because they had practiced. I mean, there's a lot of reasons it could have happened. That the author chooses to ascribe it to the relic is very interesting. And from my perspective, it ultimately doesn't matter, I suppose, whether or not it actually was a miracle. I'm not trying to assess miracles. I'm not a theologian. I'm not, interested, that's not my area. But from my perspective, it's interesting that the authors are saying that it has these effects. They are crediting it. And one thing that struck me as I pondered this is it's really no different than modern warfare, where if you talk to soldiers after an engagement and you say, okay, so you were successful. Why did that go so well? Or why did this happen? The soldiers will tell stories, their commanders will tell stories, and then historians looking at it from a distance will reach their own conclusions about what really mattered. And so they'll say things like, in this instance, it was the leadership of Ulysses S. Grant that really saved the day.
Right.
You say, well, okay, that's an interpretation you are making as a historian. You might be right, you might be wrong. It's the same with these true cross references. Those were conclusions reached by those historians of the day, and they could be right or they could be wrong.
Absolutely. So now let's jump ahead in history, because I'm really interested of the true cross's role in the late medieval period, the pre-modern era, as well as the age of exploration. Because when people think of, just the true cross, the one area in history they think that it's the most prevalent and sort of just fades away into obscurity is, of course, as we talked about before, was the Crusades, that it was taken by the Crusaders to use as a sort of right that, the power of the Lord is on our side, our cause is just. And then, of course, as you mentioned also before, the Battle of the Teen with Saladin. Saladin takes a section of the True Cross. The Crusaders try to get it back. And some could argue that, Saladin took the piece of True Cross, defeating the morale of the Crusaders, and that is how he was able to be successful in his campaigns against King Richard and the other Crusader kings. That is one hypothesis, one theory. But as you just mentioned, Professor Hosler, that the True Cross, at least some pieces of it, do pop up outside, or at least after the crusading period, after the Seventh Crusade. So let's focus in on that. So where do you see it here in Europe during, let's say, the Age of Reformation and the Age of Exploration?
So the Reformation is easy. It's all over the place. The cross, because of the multiplication of the pieces, because of the trade in forgeries. So pieces of the cross that may not be real, and and that's a whole separate authentication subject, right?
Right.
Because of the devotions to it and the various shrines and monasteries named after it, like Holy Cross in Ireland and places like that. It's all over the place. It's all over the place enough that it will be attacked and ridiculed by Protestant reformers. They really do zero in on it and target not just the True Cross, but relics in general, and then other associated things that go along with that, like icons and religious images, right? And so you see discussion of the cross, and one thing that's in my book is all about Martin Luther and Martin Bucer and Andreas Karlstadt and John Calvin and Thomas Cranmer and all of these reformer writers. They're all going after it, and gradually the consensus becomes that veneration of the cross, devotion to the cross, is more or less idolatry. And that's really kind of the attack of the reformers, right? That this is an idolatrous practice, that we ought to get rid of relics, and the True Cross itself becomes idolatrous in that sense. And then they carry it forward, depending on what confession you're reading. Not only is pieces of the True Cross idolatrous, but crucifixes are idolatrous, and then eventually just crosses in general are idolatrous. And so you see these waves of iconoclasm in the 16th and 17th century where reformers will, and usually regarded as kind of iconoclastic zealots, right, will go after and destroy these things: destroy relics, destroy images, destroy statues,
Right.
paintings, all that kind of stuff, right? So in the Reformation, you see the cross all over the place, and then you likewise have like a defense against it, where in the Catholic and Orthodox lands, where they say, well, we're not buying this Reformation attitude. We believe that relics are real and that veneration is important, and so we'll do what we can to protect these things, right?
Right.
And so I've seen fighting over the cross. It happens in an intellectual sense in the writings of the Reformation, but then it happens during the German Peasants' War. It happens during the French Wars of Religion, during the War of the Three Henris, for example. It happens in the 30 Years' War, starting in 1618, and all the way through to the end of the 17th century. You actually see lots of fighting where the cross is there. Now, is it the cause of any of this? No. Is it the main thing they're fighting about? Certainly not. Those disputes they're so much more broad and wide ranging.
Right.
But the cross and other relics get swept up into them as sort of things, right? Now, concurrently with that, you have the age of exploration, right? And you're talking here about, you have to say, well, who's doing the initial exploring? What is their persuasion, when it comes to relics? And then what are they doing with them? Well, the early explorers, they're Catholic. The Portuguese, they're Catholic. The Spanish, they're Catholic, right? And eventually you get the great English explorers who are not, but in the beginning, if you talk about, so for example, I'll give you an example, Henry the Navigator, who is not a explorer per se, but he funds and sponsors the Portuguese exploration, right? He had a personal piece of the True Cross. When he goes to war in Morocco in the 15th century, he brings the piece of the True Cross with him to siege. Yeah. So you have those sorts of figures. You have the Habsburg emperors who are in their own way involved in this, who have their own personal pieces. The kings of Spain, Charles V, had multiple pieces of the True Cross, and he in fact died with one at his retirement home. Retirement home is not the right way. He goes off to a convent and he dies there, right? But he has a piece of the cross with him, right? Then you have the explorers themselves who go out. Now, they're not necessarily bringing the cross with them, right? The cross, at least I've not been able to find. I don't think the cross is aboard the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, right? It's not. But if you look at these explorers and where they land, what do they do when they get there? They name the first spot they land Veracruz.
Yes.
True Cross, right? And so that is, you're talking about, so for example, Cabral, the Portuguese explorer who goes to Brazil, right? Names the Ilha de Veracruz, the island of the True Cross, where he first lands, right? Cortez, it will become Mexico, right? The rich city of the True Cross, Villa Rica de la Veracruz, right? So they're naming things after the True Cross. So that's their impulse. And then once they do, the True Cross comes after them when they are settling, colonizing, fighting in these newly discovered territories, or territories that they've just now sort of gotten access to, like India, right? The True Cross arrives. So Alfonso de Albuquerque has a piece of the True Cross, right? The Jesuits bring the True Cross over to India. They bring the True Cross over to places like Japan and China. And so in the wake of these explorers, you have the cross. It's prominent in the explorations itself, and then it becomes prominent, sort of afterwards, and as the flow of people comes in afterwards. And you can see if you sort of broaden that and say, okay, not just the True Crosses and the relics, but crosses in general, then you widen the aperture and it becomes a huge subject, because you have, for example, down with the Inca, you have the building of crosses, of monumental crosses. You have Magellan's Cross in the Philippines. Those sorts of things. Wherever the explorers go, the cross follows. And so it's almost like, as the cross is being attacked and scrutinized in Europe, it's sort of devotion to it sort of squirts out on the back end and goes around the world, where it will continue being important for a long time. I've detected, pieces of the cross in Japan all the way up until the Tokugawa shogunate finally clamps down and against all Catholicism and and kills thousands, expels the Jesuit missionaries, right? But up until that point, you see processions with the True Cross, and you even see some native Japanese who come into possession of it. So the Age of Exploration is really, really interesting. And I would add on the back end of that, and this is where history becomes complicated, because you say, well, if I want to write a chapter, where do I start it? Where do I end it? But so many things are happening at the same time in the 1400s and 1500s, right? You kind of cross-pollination. This is also in that same period when the greatest works of art about the True Cross are appearing in Italy. So the most famous is by Piero della Francesca, who creates this wonderful 9 panels, I think, fresco of the legend of the True Cross, telling the story from the crucifixion to Helena, through the Byzantines, this sort of thing. But all kinds of Italian artists who are creating these works of art about the True Cross. That's all going on while the ships are crossing the ocean, while the Reformation is raging, while the 30 Years' War is being fought. And so you really have this kind of nexus where I call it I've got sort of the glorification of the True Cross, where it's reached its apex, right? It has become accepted in Catholic quarters, and it's sort of exploding all the way around the world. And then back in Europe, you have this rearguard action being fought by the Protestants, who are saying, no, we have to. This is superstition, this is idolatry, this is relic worship, this is worship of the saints, not of Jesus, and that kind of fight against. But ultimately, it's a fight they lose. Regionally, they succeed, and you can say, okay, we've squelched, in the Low Countries for a time, or in England for a time, we've kind of squelched relic devotions. We've destroyed a lot of them, but in the rest of the world, that just hasn't happened. And the fact that there's an annual celebration to this day, every year, of the True Cross in Ethiopia, using fragments of the cross that found its way to sub-Saharan Africa. And so it's a real interesting dynamic. It's almost like the reformers got to it too late. If you'd gone and had a more concerted effort in the early years, when the early Christians were a little skeptical about relics and about saintly veneration, and weren't quite sure if that was a good idea or not. If you wanted to get rid of it, that sort of would have been the time. But obviously, it's I'm insisting people in one period look back upon the other, and that's never rational, right? But by the time Calvin comes out swinging with his treatise against the relics, this is where he has his very famous line that most people get wrong, that if you collected all the pieces of the True Cross, it would constitute the cargo of a ship. In other words, they're all fakes. By the time he comes out with that, you're in the 16th century. It's the ships have sailed. They're on their way. They've landed in South America. They've landed in North America. They're around the world, and the genie is out of the bottle.
Right. And it all seems to sound like, wrapping everything together, you could argue that the True Cross in a way represents, the expansion of the Catholic faith, and how, you're right that if you try to, squash it in Europe, it's already traveled around the world. Some parts of Africa have been influenced by it, parts of India, parts of the Levant, China, Macau, Japan, the Americas. It's spread all over the world. So it is fascinating how the True Cross, whether an actual piece or at least the iconography or the power of it, has shaped human history and has allowed these things to happen. And it's just really fascinating to really see how this piece of history, religious history, has truly changed the world. You can argue for better or for worse. And to sort of tie it all in together, Professor Hosler, throughout your research and when you finish your book, what is probably the one thing you hope people will take away from reading your book on the history of the True Cross?
That's a great question. I haven't really thought about it yet. I think one thing that comes to mind is that people will take these kinds of things more seriously.
Mm.
I think it's easy to write off, even for modern Christians, to write off things like the miraculous, to write off the belief in the power of relics, the importance of these sorts of things. It kind of becomes even for people who believe and say, well, yeah, but that's kind of all ancillary. Those are these little other pieces that aren't very important to me, and that's fine. But the idea that the material evidence of the divine, which is what we're really talking about here, the
Right.
material that what is believed to be the material evidence of the divine, that has an enduring importance and meaning for people. That does not just go away because you have an age of enlightenment, because you have a scientific method, right? Because you have modernity. Those things persist. They stay, they have deep meaning. And to write them off is really to write off a very sincere belief on the part of huge swaths of the population, right? When people, laugh at an icon or something like that, they don't realize that the Orthodox world has kept that alive for a millennia and a half or more. And it is so important to Orthodox believers. It is part and parcel with their faith. And so I think just to take these things more seriously, that scientific thought, rational thought, philosophical thought does not eliminate humans' connection to these kinds of things. So I think that would be one thing that kind of strikes my mind to be important. Another I would say is the importance of looking at the world when we look at historical phenomenon.
Right.
When I was writing up this book, I could have just made it about Europe. And honestly, a lot of it is about Europe, because that is really that's the epicenter for a lot of this stuff. It starts in the Near East and remains important there forever. But it's the European story that really pushes and promotes. And by that, I don't mean necessarily physically in Europe, but Europeans, right? Whether they're in the Near East on crusade or whether, that sort of thing, right? I could have just done it about Europe and European influences, but that really takes away such a huge part of the story.
Right.
And I think people would find for a lot of historical phenomenon, bringing in the larger world is really important, really necessary to understand the true story of something. It of course makes everything much more complicated, because now, if you're a professional historian and you say, well, I'm a specialist in this, now you're reading books about India and, trying to wrap your head around a whole different historiography. And it's hard.
It is.
And I would say it's daunting. It's very daunting to believe, I can, do I have the chops to do this? Do I dare read about some of these things? But as more and more time goes on, I become convinced that you can't just take your history and keep it regional and say, well, I just look at Northwest Europe in this sort of time. That's great for specialist studies, but to really to sort of understand the broad swath, the broad trends of history, you got to widen the aperture. And so
Absolutely.
I think that would be the other piece. I think right now, although I'd have to think about it some more. I'm sure by the time I'm done, there'll be other things that pop up that I really hope people take this away or this away or this away. But I said the broad scope and then the seriousness of religious history. It's not something that we've gotten past. It's something that remains with us.
And I think that is a perfect ending to an incredible episode here on the Historians Lounge. Want to give a huge thank you to Professor Hosler for coming back on the show and telling us all about his upcoming book and his research thus far. Thank you, Professor, for coming back on the show, and we wish you the very best. And where can people find you to stay up to date with your research, as well as purchase copies of your previous works?
The easiest way to find me is on X, I suppose, former Twitter. I post pretty regularly there about what I'm up to. And there's there's a link to my CV so people can look at it and find things if they're interested in what I've been up to. So, but thanks for having me on. It's been great.
No problem, Professor. No problem. And hopefully I can have you back on again for a third time to talk about another one of your books or maybe another topic within your specialization. So if you want to see Professor Hosler back on the show, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, as well as click on the links, which I'll be providing down below in the description of this video. And again, a huge thank you to Professor Hosler for coming back on the show. We wish him the very best with his research and his upcoming book. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for episode 6 of season 3 of the Historians Lounge. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And we will see you all in the next episode.